This is the Teaching Privacy and Security Inclusively panel. We are all going to introduce ourselves. I am moderating. I'm going to ask these amazing people some questions. There's going to be an opportunity for y'all to ask all of us some questions. And then we'll go back to doing some questions for ourselves with some more questions at the end. Does that sound good to everyone? Yeah. This is like a small enough group that I feel like we should be coming to consensus instead of just talking at you. So I'm going to start by introducing myself. My name is Lo Smith. I am a senior programs manager with NDIA. My background previously is in libraries. I hold an MLS from Simmons University. My pronouns are they, them. And I will be moderating and crowd controlling in this fantastic panel. Somebody else introduce yourself.
All right, I'll go. I'm on the end. My name is Amy Hinojosa. I am the president and CEO of MANA, a national Latina organization. We're the oldest and largest Hispanic women's organization in the country with chapters and affiliates across the country, and we focus on leadership development, community service, education, and advocacy.
Great. I'm Amy VanDeVelde. I'm from the Oasis Institute in St. Louis, and I lead a national program called Oasis Connections. It's a digital skills program, and we've been teaching cybersecurity since 2004.
My name is Brandon. I use he, him pronouns. I'm an organizer with Media Justice, working on internet rights. And at Media Justice, we do all kinds of work around media and technology through the intersectional lens of racial, economic, and gender justice. And we're here to burn shit down.
I endorse this. So my first basic question for all of my friends on the panel with me here is an icebreaker that I thought of, and now it's sort of broken my brain. So I'm starting with Brandon, and we're going to bring it down the line. I'm answering this too. When was the first time you thought about online privacy and security for yourself and or for others?
Yeah, I'm going to not exactly answer your question. I'm going to answer a similar question, though. So there are two kind of quick examples of kind of the way that I've thought about safety and security in my life. I think the first is that just generally growing up and still, most people in my family, we don't lock our doors. You know, you could come to my house, you go to my dad's house today, you could walk to my mom's house today, you just walk right in. And, you know, I think a lot of times we think about safety and security in terms of better locks or stronger doors, but really safety is a psychological kind of sensation. It's not a concrete thing. And so what it really means to be safe is to feel like you live in a community without fear, without that kind of psychological hanging over you. And then real quick, another example where this exact example came up in a slightly more concrete way. I was an English teacher in the Peace Corps in West Africa, and unfortunately our program got shut down, and for whatever reasons, there were security concerns that the government had. But when we actually met, we had like a consolidation phase before the evacuation phase, and they asked all of us volunteers, like, what were our safety and security concerns? And people said, well, street dogs and traveling during the rainy season. But nobody was concerned about whatever kind of political violence or whatever kind of things that the State Department was worried about, because we knew fundamentally that being successful in the Peace Corps, and Peace Corps is problematic. I'm not advocating for the Peace Corps as non-problematic, but to be successful in the Peace Corps, you have to be a part of a community. And so we knew fundamentally that we were safe because our communities would keep us safe. And so that's how I entered this conversation, is thinking about that.
Great. I wish I could remember when I wasn't thinking about security. I'm glad you brought up the unlocked doors, because I lived in a small town in Illinois and was always very concerned about the doors being locked. And my parents were like, what is wrong with you? And I just was born that way. And I would say that thinking about security and privacy, the movie War Games was a little bit informative to me in high school, and sort of like, how could that happen, right? In 1983. And so that probably started me on my safety and privacy journey, that movie.
Yeah, I just recently watched War Games. It's really good. I think it is one of those like fundamental movies for folks in digital inclusion to watch. Should we make a movie syllabus?
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah.
All right,
an accompanying syllabus, yeah, absolutely.
There will be a movie syllabus of great movies for folks in the digital inclusion sphere, with War Games definitely kicking it off. A young Matthew Broderick, if you're ready for that. For me, thinking about online privacy and security was very early. I went to a Title I school, and we had Wi-Fi in my kindergarten. one of the first things that was hammered into us all of the time was you never, ever, ever tell anyone your real name on the internet. You never post anything about yourself or information. You never communicate with strangers or people you don't know. And that started out the second that they connected us to the internet. And we had probably unfiltered internet access because, well, Title I school, free Wi-Fi in kindergarten, laptops handed out to the kids, but teachers who were not up on their own digital skills. So we were out there getting into all kinds of trouble. But it was hammered into us, do not connect with other people online. And now my entire job is connecting with other people online. So it's been, in the beginning, it was hard to sort of flip that script and think about, like, now this is my time to reach out and find those weirdos on the internet and ask them to be my friend.
For me, I think the first time that I actually thought about the internet and security was when To Catch a Predator came out, and we started to realize how many children were vulnerable online. And, you know, because if you ever saw the show, and, you know, you could think whatever you want about Chris Hansen, right? But there were people who were agreeing every day and time of the hour to come to this house to meet this child, supposedly, right? And so working with children and youth in our Hermanitas program, for me, that was such an eye-opener of, you know, we think about safety, and I worked with the Girl Scouts for many years, and we always thought of things in terms of liability. Now, when you're thinking about kids and their online access and who has access to them, right? So the issues of how, and it's so important, right? Unless it's drilled into kids' heads, just the idea of what you put online can make a difference. And now that, you know, that was when we had AOL dial-up, right? So now that you can post everything immediately on Instagram or TikTok, right? The stakes are so much higher now.
Yeah, well,
Absolutely.
that's so much to think about. So we're really here to talk about teaching privacy and security inclusively, but as somebody who enjoys a lot of physical sports, I think about learning the negative first. So when we talk about doing things inclusively, we first have to look at the exclusivity of it. So I'd love to hear from all of y'all about some examples of exclusion that we've seen or felt within privacy and security, both conversations and education, and how these really highlight the impacts of either a lack or an exclusion of security and privacy conversations within vulnerable communities. If you forget that question anywhere halfway through, let me know. I got you.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start with one story about older adults are generally stereotypically considered to be out of the conversation, right? So we make these assumptions about age and what people do and don't do. I happen to hang out with a crowd of over 70 people who are very astute technologists and understand how to use things. And what I think is interesting is the nuance of everybody of all ages. I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it. In kindergarten you had Wi-Fi, but
25 years ago, just to add numbers.
Right. So, you know, realizing that so much of a person's experience with digital skills is based on their career and what they were exposed to in a career. I had a colleague, Leslie Scott from Kansas City, say to me the other day, you know, the reason that I am more involved in digital skills is because I had to use PageMaker as a master's student. But I have a friend who never used PageMaker and used a Selectric typewriter, and she calls herself old and not able to use the internet. So very much a part of what you were exposed to if your school had Wi-Fi. And so then the exclusion, it's almost hard to determine where does the exclusion come from, because where did you go to school? How did you get access to any kind of technology? How would you get trained in it? Did you live in a community that had a factory where you never touched a typewriter? Then you were excluded from access to technology. So it's very challenging to figure out why people were excluded and how they perceived themselves.
Yeah. So I to piggyback off of that, I would also add that it also has to do with the development of technology, right? And who is developing the technology? What is their worldview? Where did they come from? What did they have access to? And then the algorithms that emanate from the work that they do. what assumptions are they making about your life or anyone else's life to decide whether or not information gets pushed in your direction or not pushed in your direction, right? And so if we're thinking about, if we're sort of thinking backwards, right, and we're sort of at the point, because of the way the internet has propagated over the last 30 years, we're sort of trying to put the toothpaste back in the tube right now and trying to figure out, okay, who's thinking about how, for example, law enforcement relates with technology, right? Is it fair for law enforcement agencies to be able to use Ring technology or to be able to use locators on Facebook to look for whether it's someone who ICE is looking for, whether someone law enforcement is looking for, or maybe not looking for, maybe they're misidentified by AI, right? And so, in my mind, the way we're looking at it is we're having to look backwards to see how people are being impacted negatively, but then going back to those developers and really talking about how we widen their worldview in order to widen, what's happening with those algorithms.
And can I clarify something that you just said? I think that I remember watching Oprah, and she was saying lighting is everything. And as a fair complected person, I didn't understand what she was talking about. But artificial intelligence isn't very good at identifying darker toned skins. It's actually terrible. So if the developers of AI are white and they're using facial recognition on white people, then the algorithms aren't designed to work. And I don't know a ton about this, so Brandon, you may know more about it. But it was alarming to me when I learned that. It was just alarming. So love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, y'all got another hour to talk about this. If y'all want to do an hour session on abolition in tech, that would be incredible. And yeah, I mean,
Do you want to do that session with me?
let's do it. And I would love to.
San Antonio.
All right, I would love to say more about facial recognition, but I think that is a great example. And I would just share a resource that people are thinking about from that perspective at the start. There was a wonderful book that recently came out, and also a set of principles and zines called Design Justice. That's out of the AMC and out of the Detroit Digital, or the Detroit, there's so many acronyms, I'm going to get it wrong, but it's out of some of the incredible digital justice work happening in Detroit. And it's really looking at that, thinking about how do we kind of, from the beginning, design things to be more equitable or just, or just not terrible, just not awful and racist. Yeah, and I think that, with the facial recognition, the phrase that was coined by Joy Balwami and folks at the Algorithm Justice League is that's the pale male problem, because it's not just that it's worse at color, it's also worse at identifying women. And it's not any good at really dealing with the fact that when we think about men and women in binary, it's not a helpful way of seeing things in today's society. But the way that, so I can go on and on and on. I'd also say, but you're right, it was what they put into that system, and they put a lot of pale males into it. But I think that in general, if we look at the question you're asking about from the start, we could also define that as the pale male problem. There's a lot of white men that are designing these things, and it's not that they necessarily have a desire to be harmful, but they just don't necessarily know to think. Like the IRS, they were about to use this facial recognition software to force people in order to be able to access their taxes online. I don't think anybody at the IRS sat in a meeting and said, how do we make it harder for black women to file their taxes? But I also don't think that anybody at the IRS ever once said, is this going to make it harder for black women to file their taxes? But I have to stop going on and on. I think language is really important, and that's how we see things excluded. So whether or not we're thinking about getting out information to help full access to something like Affordable Connectivity Program, as much as we tried to do, we didn't have enough language resources for that. But also when we think about, we live in this society that is like tilting towards fascism, and also like a pandemic of misinformation. A lot of the kinds of systems that have been put in place to try to moderate these platforms, or to try to think about how do we have some kind of guardrails around conversation when it's literally people's lives on the line, they're only thinking about it in English. They're not moderating in these other languages, whether or not people are in the US or abroad. And so I think that there's a lot that we have to think about, but I'll just stop. There's a lot we have to think about, but I think language is a really important aspect, and we can't just think that we're going to fix these systems in English, and then that's going to make these safe systems for everybody.
That actually, you're really good at leading the questions. So one of the questions that I inserted into this discussion, I sent all of these out, and then at last minute I was like, I got another one for y'all. I recently was approached to be on a panel about privacy and security education and digital inclusion. And I pulled out my slide deck and I started looking through the three legs of the stool and everything, and I couldn't figure out where privacy and security education fit within digital inclusion. Where do we believe it's a digital skill? Should it be its own category? And when we're thinking about beginning to teach it and sort of lead on an inclusive education of privacy and security, how do we begin framing it within the work we're already doing? Or is it time to build a little annex on and say, all right, this is where it lives?
I'm tempted to say it needs its own priority only because of the sheer volume of funds that are lost from people who are scammed. You know, the ageist reporting has been that older adults fall prey to scams more often. What's being released recently by an AARP study is that it more has to do with your emotional state than your age. However, older adults deal with losing more partners. They have, you know, significant traumas that can lead them to those emotional states, and they have more wealth amassed. So if someone were to scam someone younger, they're not going to have the savings to drain. But an older adult could lose their entire life savings in one transaction. And so that's the only reason I think it needs to be prioritized as a separate option, because of the amount of money that's being lost by victims.
I would agree with that, and I think because privacy and security impacts every facet of your life. It is financial, but it is emotional, but it does, you know, relate to your family and how you can provide for them. I just saw The Tinder Swindler, you know, to your
Yes.
point, I just saw that on Netflix, and this idea, and you're absolutely right, these are emotional reactions to something online that may not have the same intention on the other end, right? And so it's so important, and you know, it's almost like, you know, having to learn, you know, having to go to traffic school, right, before you get your driver's license, you know, because there are so many pratfalls that people can fall into at any age that you know, there has to be a special education segment just for that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to answer. There's a lot of ways that you could fit it in. Sometimes people have that fourth stool about having like useful things to be connected to, and that's really how I think about it, is in terms of, you know, all of us here are here because we want to connect people to all of the amazing things you can do with technology. But I don't think that we think enough about all of the harmful systems that people are also connected to. Like, it's great if someone can get on Facebook, I guess, maybe not, you know? And that fundamentally it goes back to the kind of introduction question for me, is it's less about, you know, where it fits in the stool, and understanding that we can give people all kinds of skills. We can give people all kinds of knowledge. But unless we're equipping them to also think about the systems that are in place, unless we're also thinking about the systems, you know, I think that there was just an FTC report out that said like almost $1 trillion of fraud happened through social media. There was an FTC report that came out last year that said, you know, we all think about Facebook and Google and Amazon of tracking us everywhere. And your internet service providers, that access piece, the FTC report said they're worse. And they're worse not just because like they're as evil as every other corporation, although they are, but they're worse because they're also these vertically integrated monopolies. And so they're not just tracking your internet, they're tracking what you're watching, they're tracking, you know, they know if you pass gas what it smells like. And they're putting that all together and tracking us around. And so like, I think it's hard to, you know, you have to think about like teaching it as kind of a fundamental part of education about how to do all of these things online, and teaching people that we actually right now live in kind of fundamentally unsafe communities. And I don't say that to tell people to be pessimistic, but so that they can see that and know that, and then take action that way. Something that came out of the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition and was used by our data bodies was this concept of power, not paranoia. And so I don't know where it fits exactly in the stool, but we can't just make people feel like, despite the fact that we live in these kinds of terribly oppressive systems, there's nothing they can do about it. So thinking about it in terms of how we make people feel powerful in those situations, and wherever you fit that in the stool, that's great. Maybe it's working with me to destroy Comcast, come sign up, let's do that, that's great. Or maybe, you know, whatever that looks like.
Yeah, as always, you just set me up for another question. So thank you for clearly having them on your tablet in front of you and just leading us down a path. And this also relates to something that we talked about, which is when we have privacy and security education being taught, who are we expecting to learn this from within our own communities? And like, who should we be asking for this kind of education from?
Well, I have a standard answer. If you've ever followed anything that I've done, I often say, thank you to the nation's public librarians. It's the
You're
nation's
welcome.
help desk. Thank you. It's the nation's help desk. But in the past 2 years, it was brought to my attention by a banker in St. Louis that, he said, Amy, all our branches, every day, our tellers, our frontline people spend time trying to convince our customers that they should not transfer money to the person who reached out to them online. And I said, what? And he said, no, every day in every branch. And customers of all ages are convinced that they need to wire transfer this money, or Venmo now, and they don't understand that they can't get the money back. If they transfer it, it's gone. And so that really led me to say, your bank is your help desk. They are waiting to help you, and you should always talk to someone if you have a question. I struggle. My ability to scale our efforts is directly tied to who could teach these classes, and who can I trust to teach a vulnerable population. How do I know someone who reaches out to me on the internet wouldn't be somebody exploiting people that they're training? So it's a challenge. I don't have an answer, but I envision a national core of people who are vetted and trained to do this work.
Well, as a community advocate, my fallback is always the community is going to be your best resource, right? And in the Latino community, we rely on trusted messengers in the community. And so even if training were available at the local bank or at the library, they may not be inclined to go and receive that information from there. So in my mind, regardless of whether or not there is a writ large program, it's still going to fall to community advocates to reach the communities that they serve. And so it really is, we really are in an all hands on deck moment, because, I think you're right, Lo, when you're talking about from the time you get your first tablet in grade school, there are certain things that just have to be drilled into your head, and those messages have to continue throughout your life, even into, your older age, right, where you're still just as vulnerable to scams as you were as a child.
Yeah, I guess for me, it's not so much about, I would agree with what both y'all are saying, and especially the idea that the community is a resource. You can't really think of it as like who has knowledge that can then like deposit that knowledge into others. You really have to think about it as a practice. I think one of the emergent leaders yesterday talked about how they were working with an older gentleman in Boston, and they thought this person's never going to learn anything in his class. But one of the examples she gave was like, they tried to teach him how to use maps. He's like, you're teaching me how to use the map? I am the map. And so, I think,
Boston.
Right, I don't think that you can think of it as terms of like, who is the person that holds the knowledge? You have to think about it, again, like how do we create this community practice of being together and thinking about it in ways that are important for us. So that's what I would say. Everybody's a part of it. It's not a one-way street.
Yeah, definitely. All right, so we've done a little bit of talking now, and I've got some questions, but I wanted to offer a time to do a few questions from the audience sort of in the middle, so that nobody feels like they're competing for time or space. And if you've got a question that's come up immediately and you'd like to pop up to the mic and ask it to us, please do that now. So anybody, please stand up, speak right into that mic and ask us your question.
You're in the perfect place.
You're there, you're doing it.
I'm right here. Hi, I'm Lisette. I work at Malwarebytes, so we're actually a cybersecurity firm. And one of the things that we're looking to do is really help contribute to this education piece. But a challenge that we're having is really, how do we do this in like really digestible, kitted ways so that we can help our nonprofits do this education? And what really is the right amount? Because just how much curriculum can fit, if you want it to be a quick, 5-minute video versus something longer, like what can people digest, and how can we help, being a vendor with resources and funds, provide information that's best for folks in order to educate and help drive some of this content.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this one. So what I would say, and the model that we try to use, and train the trainer is the way to go, right? And it sounds like that's the direction that you're going in. But if I were you, what my suggestion would be is to do some focus groups, right? Partner strategically with different communities, right? And bring their organizations in, bring, whether it's their youth, whether it's their trainers, right? To see how that training that you're coming up with, how that resonates, right? Because often I will get lots of stuff, and often it's from the federal government. Hey, we want to teach, someone how to do this, right? Or we want to teach a community how to do this. And they send me tools that don't resonate with my community, right? So if you have that feedback in real time before it goes out to community, then everybody wins there, right? And it just takes that extra step that's often not taken.
We have a free online course that's an hour and 15 minutes that people could walk themselves through. We have short content videos. And I think that I wish there were a formula I could tell you, because it so much depends on the person's experience again. If an older adult is experiencing some cognitive decline, it's not really diagnosed, but just the concepts we're teaching, it's just like, wait, what do I have to do? So I got to do two-factor authentication, and I've got to change the passwords that I already have. Like, just those two tasks are monumental. And so, but I have other people who are like, give me more. Give me more. And so we're trying to just give different bite size, a snack size and a more of a meal size, so that people can get their needs met and, touch as many topics as they can. And what I've been saying lately to our people is has to become a practice in your life. This has to be something that you touch more than once a year, and feel free to come to a class more than once, and don't try to implement all of the things that you hear, because once someone gets into the chat of these Zoom meetings and starts asking other questions, we can go off the rails to lots of other issues that weren't really about the class we were teaching. And so, I'm trying to give them lots of choices is the best we've come up with.
Yeah, I guess for me, I would say, if there's a way to do it to where whatever the process looks like, it can be more conversational than just like, here, watch this thing. I think that's helpful. And then I would point you to some great resources I think have been really useful. So one is our Data Bodies project, and they had kind of an interim report that is really narrative driven. And so they went and talked to community members about kind of their experiences with what it meant to have these data bodies existing. And then I think from a result of that was the Digital Defense Playbook. So there's some stuff in there. And then recently also from the Consentful Tech Project, Detroit Community Technology Project, and Data for Black Lives. The title of this new one that I haven't looked into a lot, but it's got really great curriculum for this conversation. It's from protecting ourselves to taking care of each other. And I think that what's so helpful about those resources, they really do take a narrative approach. And so instead of thinking about, these are like the 5 skills you need online, it's more, you start with a conversation about what people know, what their fears are. I don't know if that is going to work perfect when you're thinking about it from where you're thinking about it, but I think you can find some helpful and instructional things in there to think about how do you have this conversation, even if it has to be one way, like how do you think about it in terms of meeting people where they are?
More questions? Hop to the mic so we can get it transcribed and also available for our live stream friends.
I'm thinking specifically in banking, when we talk about security measures, a lot of our answers don't seem to be inclusive anyway, like two-factor authentication. You have to have not only your laptop, but then also a cell phone. How do you combat that conversation when you're talking to those people, risking? That's a very loaded question, but
Yeah, it's really
how do you
hard.
choose?
Right? I mean, I'm in the middle of a lively conversation right now about the fact that Google is now requiring two-factor authentication. So what does that mean for all of us who've and Oasis has not, but many organizations have disseminated devices, free low-cost devices, to people who don't have a device. So now they've got their first device, but they don't have a mobile phone. And so I don't know the answer yet. If there's a way to set up two-factor authentication with that actual device and receive an email notification, So it's very complicated, and you're asking people who that aren't well resourced with all these tools to do it. So I don't have a good answer, but I'm glad that that is an issue that is, there's so many things coalescing and more requirements being put on the user. How do we help the user to be able to even participate in those activities? And I don't have a good answer, sadly.
Yeah, and I think that's a great example of where it's really important to engage the industry, right? And advocates have to have those open conversations with the industry to say, look, this is what's happening in real time. Folks don't have a cell phone and a laptop, right? But yet they're being required to do the two-factor authentication thing, right? And so, because we have to have that open line of communication to make any of this work, right? Because if we're out in the communities just trying to react, we're never going to catch up, and our communities aren't going to be as safe as we want them to be.
Anything to add?
Yes, come on, sir. We've got time for definitely one more question now, and then more at the end.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a statement more than a question. When I think about what you were talking about the social and emotional impacts, and there are boardrooms and think tanks in corporations across the country studying how to manipulate people's emotions, and just think, I mean, you talked about the money, but just think of this entity that exists that's their sole purpose, is to get at people's vulnerabilities in that way, and that's what you're up against as much as the money. So.
Yeah, entirely. So, the Facebook papers proved what some of us have believed for a long time, right? That many of us were concerned. I was reluctantly on Facebook. But, I just think that for the regular person who wants pictures of their family members, and it's the only way they can get pictures from somebody who lives far away, that's a lot of, at least older adults' motivation and drive to get on Facebook, was just to simply see pictures and be part of the conversation of the family when they were disconnected. But I don't think many of them understood how they were being tracked or how the algorithm was being built. And it's very, very disturbing what's come out in the Facebook papers. And so, again, how do we as citizens, Brandon would have much better information about this than me, but how do we mobilize ourselves to say, this is so, I mean, I knew a lot about Facebook, but I didn't understand how involved they were in human trafficking. And that was just sickening to me that, that a major corporation is participating in that kind of activity. So, I don't have good answers for that one.
Yeah. All right, now it's back to some of the moderated questions for us. And this is also one of a question that sort of fits in with some of the questions that have been asked, but when we are developing any of our sort of security and privacy education pieces, as a former public librarian whose entire job was the digital inclusion, whatever. If it's a problem, it's your problem. If we are low on funds or energy or education, and we're working on sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, is there any way that we could do a privacy and security one-fits-all approach? And how can we meet the needs of everyone at once in the most functional way possible? Or is it truly something that cannot be done and everything should be tailored? Go wild.
Well, if there was a one-size-fits-all approach, this conference might not be necessary and wouldn't be growing by leaps and bounds. So I would like to find a one-size-fits-all. One of the things we're exploring and attempting to pilot is an intergenerational model, where we would teach youth, because if youth, to Lo's point, youth need to understand cyber hygiene. And, many people say to me, oh, just ask the kids, they totally know. They know Snap, they know TikTok, but I don't think that they're practicing security and privacy unless their parents are harping on them, like I do to my children. And so, if we could teach youth, then youth could have the ability to go into the community and teach other people, perhaps older people. But I love also finding older people that are retiring and looking to give back. And could they be mentors to youth who, then are able to gain skills and talk to an older adult who's been there, who's worked, and can say, oh, these are the things, it'd be really good if you learned this because this could change your career. So that's what we're trying to focus on at Oasis now. But there's a lot to do and a lot of people to reach.
Yeah, I would really just like not to have to be a legal professional to agree to terms of service, right? It's because I'm not a lawyer, And even when you do the updates on your phone or you do an update on an app, they give you this huge long thing that you're supposed to read. I scroll to the bottom and hit accept, right? Because I want my phone to keep going, or I want to use that app, right? And one of the best things that I've heard over the years, and I can't take credit for this, my good friend Chris, who leads LGBT tech, has this wonderful notion that he's trying to propagate, that just like having international symbols, like on your clothes, there are these symbols that are on your clothes of cold water, hot water, what can you use, bleach, no bleach, that there should be some international symbols that are a simplified format for you to be able to use. Do you want your information distributed to a third party, yes or no? Do you consent to your information being used for X, Y, or Z? And so if there are visual cues that go along with that, it'll be much easier for people to understand at any age or literacy level, or or just any if you have a visual cue that lets you know good or bad, yes or no, that would be the most simplified way of doing it.
I think that what you can do that is one size fits all is you can think about what are the principles that are central that you're trying to get across, both in what you're doing and also what you're trying to communicate. And then I think, like I've already said, I've been recently reading, which is like a real showing of me that I used to be an educator and I didn't read until now, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And I think, really thinking, I've thought about that a lot as I've been preparing for this session. It's really just that, and thinking about, you can't plan for every conversation, but you can plan for it to be a conversation. And really thinking about how are you doing it in ways that, again, I'm just repeating myself, power, not paranoia. Like how are you doing this in a way that you're both making people feel like they're prepared to live in a system, but also aware that like the system doesn't have to stay the way it is, that they can be a part of changing that system, whether or not it's little by little and them also teaching other people, or thinking about how they build power to actually make it so that like we don't have to deal with Facebook, or we don't have to deal with these wrap contracts. Like Google wrap contracts. Read about that. Like the whole purpose of a contract is to have a legally binding consentful agreement. All these terms and services that we're dealing with, it's the opposite of that. None of us are consenting to any of this. I never told Comcast like, yeah, track everything that I do everywhere I go at all times of the day, and then just like storehouse it somewhere unsafe. So that even if I am perfectly safe in my practices, not that I'm saying I am, like it doesn't matter because they may not be, or Facebook may not be, or somebody they're selling them to, or an intermediary. And so I think it's really about thinking about what are the principles of what you're trying to accomplish and why, and then thinking about how you can do that in a way that is not a way of like domination, and not a way of like, I know and you need to know. Like I said, in pedagogy of presence is not to think of it as banking. You're not educating somebody by just like taking something and then putting it into, depositing it into them that you have. It's really got to be something done in relationship and in dialogue.
Yeah. Now I'm going to like step out of my role as moderator and answer my own question, because I heard a lot of really interesting things from both of you that's really reminded me. Also here, I am both a moderator, but I'm also here to represent the disabled community. And a lot of the things that we ask for as a community are to just, when you serve us, you serve everyone.
That's right.
And I think when we're thinking about specifically, when you brought up earlier the police surveillance, and if we are creating levels of privacy education specifically that can serve the undocumented community, that serves all of us. And when we're thinking about living in a world where we are not just sort of like looking around and accepting, and this is something that often I think we'll see more in COVID, is more people develop disabilities, we will begin to see the inaccessibilities of the world, but we're not going to accept them. And when we begin to learn and see the inaccessibilities of these privacy agreements and the level of safety and security that we are developing for ourselves, we don't have to accept them. And that we can begin to create change and know that we are developing change, and that we can keep up that sort of like, I found something, I don't like it, I would like to ask for something else, instead of just accepting, I can't open this door, I have to go around the side of the building. Yeah, cool. Thank you for letting me not be a moderator for a second. Yeah, I think there's a lot to think about.
And you're talking about, what you're talking about is universal design. And so Lo and I were connecting before the session about our use of captions. And, I've heard some people comment here that they haven't been to a conference before with captions. So when captions are available, it helps everybody that can read the captions, not just the people who need the captions because of hearing loss. And so it's like the curb cuts that, you know, if you've ever had to push a stroller or a wheelchair, you're not struggling to get it on the curb cut, but it's also easy when you break your leg and you can use the curb cut. And so just thinking about, you know, universal design as much as possible helps, you know, helps everybody.
And there was also something now, again, leading me through these questions. You guys are just dragging me right down the line. I love this. When we were talking about specifically consenting to what we're engaging with, and in communities where we're experiencing a lot of hyper-surveillance. Does anyone not know what a hyper-surveilled community is before I ask this question?
I think you should assume
Okay.
that someone in the audience.
All right, so
doesn't.
yeah, I don't want to make you out yourself. So a hyper-surveilled community is a community that has generally had its data collected, whether it is in the form of technologically or any other statistics. Police statistics are a very common one, as well as blue light cams, if you're familiar with those, security cameras in every location, and generally being observed. So when sharing information on privacy and security within our own hyper-surveilled communities, how can we do this in a way that is about power, not paranoia, without perpetuating the trauma of hyper-surveillance? Big question. Heavy duty.
I would start by saying the reason why it's so important to get people's stories is because they need to be validated and affirmed that what you're experiencing is real and that you're not screwing things up. Like, it's really important for people to be heard because we all are frustrated by these things. I don't know how many times we talk to somebody like, man, I really hated like clicking that terms and conditions thing, but it's much deeper than that. And again, I would just point people towards the amazing work that's coming out of Detroit, all of the different folks in the Detroit Digital Justice Collective, because that's something they're dealing with there. They live in a city where there's something like 40% of young folks just have no internet access. They don't have any access to the useful parts of the internet. But they also have one of these Project Greenlight cameras. They have facial recognition cameras all over the city. During the pandemic, if you're a young person that has to walk to a fast food place or a library to get the internet, just so you can have some useful access to some sort of technology, you're tracked everywhere. So it's not that the technology, it's not that connectivity doesn't exist in those neighborhoods, it's just how we choose to use it. What we choose to think of, what, as a society, how the city chooses to control or oppress people. And so I think the start of it is really in acknowledging that these experiences are really psychologically harmful and traumatic, and it's not, you know, all of this like day over day surveillance of us at whatever level, it has a cumulative impact on us. And we have to be able to think about that and unpack that as well as part of thinking about kind of then what do we do? You know, we can't just say like, tell me about how terrible everything is in your life, tell me about how horrible this world is. Okay, we got through it. Like, that's not how it works.
Yeah, and I think to so many of the points that you've made, Brendan, part of it is a community has to consent to being surveilled. You have to be able to consent to having your image taken and recorded and played back at any given time. It should be that way, right? But then why is it that we live in communities where we can catch someone, you know, on 5 different cameras walking from their house to a fast food place, but we still have to record violence from law enforcement on our cell phones, right? And so we have to start figuring out how we're balancing that safety and that equity in our communities, right? But people have to be aware of it and have to start thinking about what that means. And do my tax dollars, you know, should my tax dollars be going toward that surveillance if it's not protecting me, right? And so, you know, there are just so many layers to it. And, you know, it's coming back to the conversation of education, right, that we're having here, of what do people need to know to make those informed decisions?
And I would just add that there's a different nuance many times for older adults who may loathe surveillance of any kind. I have people come up to me and say, I'm never getting one of those Alexas because they listen to you all the time. And I said, do you have a smartphone? Yeah. I'm like, do you take it in the bathroom with you? Because it's a surveillance device. You know, and they look at me and like, I'm saying, just, you have to be aware of where your device is and if it's on. And then at the same time, you know, what if you have a new condition that develops and you decide that you would like to stay in your home? These tools can be amazing tools to help people with disabilities to stay in their own homes. You know, it's an assistive technology. Yes, it comes with a cost. And so that drives even more complexity into the situation. But hopefully we can get some of the changes that Brandon's suggesting, because it would hugely benefit people.
Yeah. Okay, and I have this is the big ask, and it is for all of us. If we can request specifically one thing from any one person, any one organization that isn't us, who is actively teaching and discussing digital privacy and security today, what are we asking them for that can happen immediately? Because as much as we want to say we need to be able to consent to what we want, that's a longer path. And as much as we want to ask for more trauma-informed trainings in hyper-surveilled communities, that takes building, and we need to have focus groups and engage with our communities and have working groups and listen to all of the community members engaged. But what can we ask for today that we can have done before lunch?
I would say that to recognize that isolation is equivalent to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, and that we don't necessarily know who is and who isn't isolated. So you don't know what their state is, their emotional state, right? If they're isolated, and that drives making these decisions hastily. So when we talk about who could be a trusted person in the community, my thing is, all of our calls to action in all of our classes are find a trusted person. And if you don't know a trusted person, talk to me and I'll help you find a trusted person.
Gosh, yeah, there's so much wrapped up in the question, right? And what can we do right now? And for me, I think that it's the same thing, right? Of reaching out and letting everyone who's in your orbit know that there are resources, right? You don't have to answer these questions alone. You don't have to be a lawyer to answer the terms and conditions. You don't have to try to figure it out on your own. There may not be easy answers, but the point of community, right, and safety, and choosing to be proactive with your own technology use and your family's technology use and understanding, that would be the big ask, right, is to engage and really get into what does all this mean? What does it mean if your child's TikTok is public, right? What does it mean if your child's Instagram is public? What does it mean when they have the geolocation on? These are things that a lot of people are not looking at, and certainly aren't looking at for their children's consumption. And so that engagement piece and understanding that this is important and we have to talk about it now would be my biggest ask.
I don't know if this is super helpful, but my answer as an organizer is, whenever people are starting to have those conversations or connecting with others, thinking about it, of course, in terms of giving people control and power in their lives, but also always trying to do it in a context of, like, we don't have to accept that these systems are the ones that we're always going to have to live with. So this is just a quick quote. I could have pulled 100 quotes from Pedagogy and President. But what he says, they must perceive their state not as fated and unalterable, but merely as limiting and therefore challenging. And so I think, we can't just teach, like, here's how you survive the systems, but we do have to give people ability to say, we can fundamentally change these. We don't have to accept it. And that's, again, like a far off thing. But if we don't start those conversations as part of that first conversation, then we're going to be having these conferences for a long time. They're going to keep getting bigger, and we're not going to get any closer.
Yeah, I think my one request of anyone who's teaching this is, I don't want to be teaching this in 10 years. I don't want to be talking about security and privacy in 15 years. My goal is for my job not to exist. I was a digital equity professional in libraries. We're doing good work. I don't want to have a job. And it's with so many other fundamental things that we need to change. The goal should not be in 10 years that our homelessness organizations are doing a great job. They should be closed. We should not be here in 10 years. I love all of you, but I want to be doing something else with you in 10 years. And at Net Inclusion Con, I want us to be doing a retrospective on how we made all of these things inclusive and accessible. I never want to have to hold this panel again, but I will until we get there. Okay. Who's got questions for us? Now that I just brought it all down and brought it back up again. If you don't have questions, then I'm going to have to go down the line. All right, question line. Then I was just going to have everybody just start, like, sharing feelings, and it's going to get...
First, when you think about the money being spent on hyper surveillance, versus the amount being spent on digital inclusion efforts. I mean, it would be staggering to see that. I think the second thing was, is there a bank of resources that would answer the questions like you just asked about what does it mean that I'm being tracked, whatever.
Yeah.
Like
no,
we could, a website with FAQs.
Gosh, I think Brennan, you have
Yeah,
great resources.
I would say definitely our data bodies is helpful.
Yeah.
And I think you can find all the different reports there. And then the other one was from protecting ourselves to taking care of each other.
That's a fantastic resource because it is both a curriculum that can be
That's right.
taught within communities as well as a document that can be read. And there's a lot of really trauma-informed work within the Consentful Tech project, so highly recommend them. And also Data for Black Lives was the other org involved in that. They've also published some other things beyond just that, from protecting ourselves, that really, really speaks to some of these issues.
Our website, Oasis Connections, has a free 1.5-hour course, self-guided, self-paced course, and we have short content, instructional videos in English and Spanish. We can translate to any language fairly inexpensively if you need resources for your community. And YouTube is widely used by older adults, despite what younger people think.
Thank you. This has all been aimed at the individual, and I was wondering how much is aimed at the organizations. I'm always surprised how many big, sophisticated organizations every day are reporting another data breach, which I can't control unless I keep changing my password. So I was wondering if there's any other than getting them better at recognizing they've been breached. I was just wondering what's been done.
I know that, I don't know all the acronyms, but the NIST, NIST is one of the agencies, federal agencies, that is helping to try to get organizations to be more responsible. I mean, if we're counting on our people out in the community to make strong passwords, but someone that works as a network administrator has not made a strong password, I mean, that's how these breaches are happening, sadly. So I would say it does boggle the mind. Having worked in IT for many years, it does boggle the mind that we still are making these rookie mistakes in the United States of America.
Yeah, no, and I think it's interesting to remember that it's we're not the top of the food chain, right? And the big companies that we think of as behemoths are also not the top of the food chain, and they have predators that are coming for them too. And it's the argument for limiting what you need to be doing online and what you're putting online in terms of your personal information.
Well, and I think I get the question often from older adults, but I don't put my stuff online. And I'm like, I know, but your healthcare provider, your bank, I mean, your information is online, whether you've made an account or not. And so that's why we're teaching you this. And I appreciate that you've had the security posture. And for some people, they have had no device, no home internet, so then they didn't even do it on purpose. But the thought that I didn't put it there, so it's not there, I often have to debunk that myth. And no, there's information out there about you. And there was, right? Before the internet, the county has your property information. I mean, the information was there. I got a new email yesterday that said energy consumption report for my exact address. So they had taken the online county property record, right? And found somehow my email address, probably because some of us use our first name, last name as our email address. So it wasn't that hard for somebody who has time and wants to get a payday to string those two pieces of information together. It looked fairly legit. It said it was from my county. But the email address was from some sole marketing AZ something, very long. And so it was not from anybody at the county trying to help me.
I don't know if this is exactly what you're looking for, but something that we think about a lot and thought about a lot, and during the pandemic, we're also a network organization, and our network members are organizations, typically movement organizations, and movements have faced kind of different but similar security risks. Some of our work is dealing with issues like the Department of Justice Black Identity Extremist kind of designation, where they want to paint Black Lives Matter activists or anybody that's, I don't know, The same stuff that happened with MLK, the same stuff that happened with COINTELPRO, and so we talk about it as COINTEL 2.0. So I think that's really somewhat of the perspective that our resources that we've created are coming from, is more thinking about as movement organizations, how do we protect ourselves and what do we need to know. And I think the website that we made for our folks was either Defend Our Movements or Defending Our Movements. I think it's defendourmovements.org. In coordination with other folks, not just Media Justice. And so there may be some helpful stuff there for organizations, but it's maybe not exactly what you're thinking of, but it may be useful, you know.
And since you all identified to be here, you might want to do more reading. So I would say that Heather McGee's work is very informative. You know, I hadn't heard the term pale male, but, you know, if white people think that, well, if a black person gets that job or that role, then I'm going to be left out. And she talks about, you know, that helping the black community also raises everybody, that everybody wins, just like universal design. And the other person is Shashana Zuboff, who has written the book on surveillance capitalism. Yeah, so she's written a whole book on it, and yeah, you can look her up on YouTube. She speaks quite articulately about the harms for all of us. So
We've got time for like 2 questions, if anybody's got questions.
Okay, I could ask a lot of questions, but I think the one I'm most interested in hearing from this panel on is something that we've noticed in conversations that we've had is we talk a lot about children accidentally exposing things online, children with social media accounts, what they're exposing. But how do we approach the conversation of parents exposing things about their children before children are 18? Just because, you know, they're not 18 yet doesn't mean that they shouldn't have some access or right to their own privacy. And that's something that we've been kind of hearing a lot more about, is children coming of age and not being happy with the digital footprint they've inherited based on their parents. So I think there's like that flip side of that conversation that needs to start being talked about a little bit more.
You know, I think it goes back to what Brandon, you were saying initially about community and feeling safe in your community. And I think that as we've all sort of grown with the internet, there's a false sense of security that has been generated there. And so we think if we put it on Facebook, well, only my friends are seeing it, right? Or only my family is seeing it. Or it's a private you know, photo thing that I created that only a few people get to see. And I think we need to start rethinking what our definition of safety is.
yeah, and I would say one recommendation I've made to parents is that, you know, cyber criminals are going after children's credit records. And so the more information that you or a family member, grandparent, I mean, whoever's putting the information out about this child and their name and their birthday, it's a treasure trove for the dark web, for cyber criminals to put on the dark web. And then the child won't know, if their parents aren't monitoring their credit history already. By the time they get out of school and go to buy their first car, they learn that they actually have a credit history and they have bad credit, and have to repair that at a time when you're trying to get launch. So maybe that could convince some parents, but some parents feel it's their right to put all this information out about their children. It's very disturbing to me.
I can't answer how to stop parents from traumatizing their children. That's another session. You know, again, like I don't think there's nothing wrong with parents wanting to share the experience of their kids growing up. You know, like you talked about, some older folks are on Facebook because they want to experience that. They want to be able to see photos of their grandkids. They want to be able to connect with their family and be in that part of that conversation. But I do think it's also important to let people know, like, these systems are not inherently safe. Like you said, like, we have these assumptions. And so I think the only way that you do something like that is more through kind of popular education or cultural organizing of helping people, again, not to say, like, don't ever put a picture of your kid online, or maybe that is a choice you make, but giving people the kind of framework that they can, just like with COVID, like we all here, we had a conversation before, do we want to do our masks on or off for this panel?
Yes.
You know, it's about figuring out what your own risk is. And so I think that if you had a parent that had been part of a webinar, a public education, or a conversation about thinking about what does it mean if you're starting to put your kid online, then that doesn't mean that they wouldn't put pictures of kids online, but they would at least have a way to think about it, and think about it in terms of a risk assessment, instead of just thinking, well, either it's all safe or either it's all so unsafe it doesn't matter what I do because they got their pictures anyway, you know, like, so I don't know if that's helpful, but I think it's almost more of like kind of a cultural or popular education kind of thing. But I think that maybe something you all could do really good on malware, but you know, maybe that's something to incorporate into what you're thinking of, actually thinking about.
It's research we're looking at doing on young adults and how they felt and what age they would want to start having agency about their online identity.
Yeah.
I've studied social emotional internet interactions and informatics in grad school because I was just bored and had a good time. But one of the important steps that I think is really easy to frame this is we must fundamentally see children as people.
Yeah.
And in addition to seeing children as people, not as an extension of our own selves or bodies, is we must see the internet as filled with people. There is no big bad. As much as I wish that I could just point at a cloaked figure that's flapping around in whatever corporation's coat we would like to, there is no supervillain. I'm not Batman. I look great in a bat suit though. But I can't drive a Batmobile. There are individual people that are doing bad things on the internet, and also there are individual people engaging in the internet. And to think about when you post someone else's photo or picture, getting consent the same way you would for touching them. We're all wearing our little like consent colors on our name badges, and beginning to have conversations surrounding posting a photo on the internet. And I think if anybody saw, what was that movie with Anna Kendrick and Blake Lively? Simple Favor, where Blake Lively her character will not allow her photo to be posted online anywhere. She takes the camera from her. I think that was a really great example of really good consent about having your photo posted. And if we begin to do this with our friends as adults, we begin to instill good culture with them engaging with their children and seeing every person's personal anything, whether it's their face, their house, their shoes being posted online, as something that we should probably check in about. And as well as then seeing children as people who we should check in about when we're posting things online. It's a great way to get the conversation started and to just keep it going with every interaction. And with that, I think we're wrapping up, but you've got one more thing if you have to go. Sprint, but also.
Don't stop posting your dog pics online though. Because I know it's hard to get consent, but I love your dog pictures. So
As long as there's no identifying information in your cat photos,
That's right.
I would also like them sent directly to my email. It is low@digitalinclusion.org. I will accept cat photos, questions, follow-up, and if you'd like to be connected with any panelists, I'll check with them first before sending your email on to them. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you.